Are antidepressants mislabeled? Should they instead be labeled for their common side effects? And is it more appropriate to call some of them anti-aphrodisiacs? Well, some doctors think so. That's because, according to a recent study, more patients taking antidepressants lost their sex drive than those cured of depression. And this could pose a problem for America. Take a look at these statistics. 1 in 10 Americans take antidepressants. 255 million antidepressant prescriptions were dispensed in the U.S. in 2011. And antidepressant use surged almost 400% from 1994 to 2008. And over 9% of American adults today suffer from depression. And it's not just their libido people are losing. Many of these meds induce anxiety and double the risk of suicide. So what are the true implications of a medicated America? To discuss this is Dr. Bruce Levine. He's a psychologist and author of the book you see there, Get Up, Stand Up, Uniting Populists, Energizing the Defeated, and Battling the Corporate Elite. Welcome, Dr. Levine. So first, I want to start off by talking about these startling numbers. Approximately 1 in 10 Americans are on antidepressants.
Yes, it's outrageous. I mean, for certain populations like women between the ages of 40 and 59 years old, it's almost 23%, according to a CDC, Centers for Disease Control report in 2011. And so, one of the questions I ask my colleagues, psychiatrists, psychologists, at what percentage point do you start to think maybe it's not an individual illness, but there's something troubling in our whole society and culture? At what number? For me, 23% is certainly the number. And like you said, it's really now up to 11% of all Americans over the age of 12 who are on antidepressants. And
we're seeing this number skyrocket, and you got to think something's going on. Are more people actually depressed, or are more people being diagnosed with depression? What's behind that?
Well, both. I mean, I think a huge part of that increase has to do with pharmaceutical company marketing. And, starting in the mid-1980s, pharmaceutical companies really started to basically annex psychiatry. And we now have a kind of full-blown psychiatric pharmaceutical industrial complex. And certainly it's in their interest to have more people depressed. And psychiatrists, it's in their interest to have more business if more people are depressed. So a lot of it is the marketing issue. But there's also, I think, a lot of the other problem is that I think everybody on antidepressants is masking some problems that were also going on in our society and culture, like what happened in the old Soviet Union, that everybody started to drink, and it wasn't a substance abuse problem that was the epidemic. It was something happening in the whole culture and society. People were very miserable and unhappy. And so we see some of that here in the United States as well.
So it seems like maybe not getting to the root of the problem, but instead trying to solve it through antidepressants or through medication.
Yes.
I think it's interesting. The U.S. is one of 2 countries that allows this direct consumer advertisement of prescription drugs. And I do want to take a look at some of these advertisements.
Bipolar depression doesn't have to consume you. Here's me, and here's my depression.
You know when you feel the weight of sadness. You may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious.
Well, I know that kind of describes me on a bad day. So I think anybody watching this can, if they're having a bad day, will be like, well, I'm kind of showing these symptoms. Maybe that's what I need to give me a little pick-me-up. But I mean, you go to the doctor and you ask for these prescriptions. I'm presuming this is what happens because they're seeing it on the TV. So, I mean, in that case, are your TV screens prescribing you medications instead of your doctor?
Yes. I mean, we know that those commercials are very effective at getting people to ask their doctors. I mean, pharmaceutical companies, there are a lot of things, but they're not stupid. And so they spend millions on these commercials to what these drugs are blockbusters at their peak. Zoloft, Prozac, all these things have been $2 billion a year, $3 billion a year drugs. That's a gigantic amount of money. And so those commercials are very effective. And nowadays, most of the antidepressants are being prescribed not by psychiatrists, actually. They're just prescribed by GP, general practitioners, primary care physicians. And so these folks have limited amount of time, so it feeds into another issue of a sort of assembly line medicine in the United States. Somebody comes in and they're bummed out. The doctor can't figure out real quickly what's wrong with them in a kind of physical sense. So they say, well, let's try some antidepressant, and they're prescribed almost like aspirin. It's like no big deal. Well, we know that they are a big deal. They have huge side effects, huge adverse effects.
So it sounds like, with this being the case, that there's a very big tendency for these kinds of medications to be over-prescribed or prescribed when maybe it's not absolutely necessary.
Oh, sure. That happens all the time, and to kids more and more. And that's a special concern of mine, that they're handed out like nothing to 12-year-old, 10-year-olds, and not taking a look at, there's often obvious losses. I mean, usually what depression is really about is a kind of a reaction to overwhelming pain in your life. And we also, those commercials, one of the ones that I noticed that you showed sort of implies, but if you listen real carefully, they say we think it may be having to do with some chemical brain imbalance. Well, they're very careful with their language, because the reality is there is no proof. In fact, the whole idea that depression is related to serotonin levels has been rejected now, but it was a great marketing kind of technique. It was almost like as effective as WMDs in getting us into the war. It was like, we think it might be there, so let's start a war. Well, we think that that depression is caused by low levels of serotonin. Well, we do know these antidepressants increase, at least temporarily, serotonin in a neurosynapse, and so this was a great marketing thing. Well, it later is discovered that there is no relationship between serotonin levels and depression. But we do know there is a relationship between a lot of things, like high unemployment and people being on public assistance and all kinds of physical problems. So we do know that overwhelming pain is highly associated with depression.
But there are some people that swear by these medications. People that say, I've been clinically suffering from depression, and finally taking these medications have enabled me to get on with my life. So would you say that there is a time and a place for these medications?
Well, we do know from the studies that absolutely, when you take a look at these studies, about 30 to 40% of the people in most of these trials do improve with antidepressants. However, what's also in placebo sugar pills, that's about the same amount. Okay, and actually, in a recent kind of Food and Drug Administration, if you took a look at the trials, all of the trials out there, on the majority of trials, that the antidepressant does not outperform a placebo. Now, for people out there, they get very upset and they get very angry. They go like, my antidepressant saved my life, and I'm really upset with you. And so I feel a little bad here, because part of how these things work, how anything that helps depression work, has to do with faith and confidence. And so part of the problem is when they hear somebody like me saying scientifically, yes, of course, 30% of people it works for, but it doesn't, that's about what a sugar pill, well, about any treatment works about that percentage point. And so scientifically, it means it really isn't that effective. But in real life, people feel that it works for them. And so when somebody comes on and says the things that I'm saying, it sort of destroys their faith and confidence, so they have to get upset and angry at a guy like me.
Well, so it's kind of like the power of the mind, that you can kind of shape your own thoughts, in which case maybe you shouldn't be taking medication, but maybe other alternatives like psychotherapy, and just changing your mindset and to really feel better.
If you want, and I'm really opposed not so much to psychiatric drugs, I'm opposed to the hypocrisy. I think people should have a right to do whatever they want. And but what we know is that when people believe that they have faith in almost any kind of drug, that it's going to be effective for them. And so another problem in the United States of America that this sort of psychiatric pharmaceutical industrial complex creates is the sort of prison industrial complex. So you have a lot of people out there who have no insurance, who have no access to Prozac and Paxil and all those things. And so what are they using? They're using illegal drugs, marijuana. They're using, some folks even using cocaine. And the reality is for some of those people out there, that it does help their depression as well. And for a drug like marijuana is actually far safer than these antidepressants in terms of adverse effects.
Okay, and I guess want to ask you, in the end, it's all, somebody's profiting. I mean, well, obviously, we know who's profiting. It's the big pharmaceutical industries. They're profiting. So, I mean, is it all about the money instead of people's well-being?
Well, unfortunately, when you have drug companies making so much money, that kind of element's going to be there, and they can spread it around to almost every kind of psychiatric institution, the American Psychiatric Association, all kinds of consumer groups, and so the profit motive has really distorted what most Americans hear about depression and ways to deal with it, whereas the reality is there are a lot of different ways, depending on your temperament, depending on your personality, Psychotherapy works fine for some people, but not for everybody. For some people, activism is the way, political activism. If you take a look at history, that's transformed people's depression. Physical exercise, there's lots of different ways, but we only hear one thing because of pharmaceutical companies.
Right. And so, I mean, we are seeing a staggering number, as we mentioned before, about 10% of the population here in the U.S. on antidepressants. I mean, can we only expect that number to go up?
Well, I would guess, although there's got to be a limit somewhere, you think. I mean, like I said, we already got 23% of women between the ages of 40 and 59. We've got increasing. What they're doing now is people are not just on one drug, okay? And they're on multiple antidepressants. And you would think that some of these drug companies wouldn't like that. They want you to use exclusively theirs. Well, one of the reasons why they're pushing people to be on multiple psychiatric drugs is it helps them in terms of if somebody goes suicidal or they go homicidal and they hurt themselves or somebody else, it creates less liability issues for them. So somebody can't say, well, it was this one drug and we're going to go after you for creating these adverse effects. So that's why they're pushing people to be on multiple psychiatric drugs, one reason.
Very interesting, Doctor. Thanks so much for coming on the show. That was Dr. Bruce Levine. He's a psychologist and author of Get Up, Stand Up, Uniting Populists, Energizing the Defeated, and Battling the Corporate Elite.